most enthusiastic supporter. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jason Helgerson.
All right, so enthusiasm, yes, I am an enthusiastic person, and I know I'm coming here at the tail end of your wonderful lunch. But so I'm pleased to be here, pleased to have this opportunity to talk to all of the partners within the Millennium PPS. I've been actually pleased in the last few weeks to have a chance to talk to similar groups. There are 25 PPSs across the state. And we certainly take the work that you do very seriously and applaud you for all that you've done so far, but also the challenge that lies ahead. A significant amount of work to be done by us collectively to achieve the goals of this ambitious program. And obviously we are going to be operating in an environment of some uncertainty. Environment where the changing priorities within Washington may at some point become a reality that we're going to have to deal with right here on the ground in Western New York. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'll also talk about our progress to date in Medicaid redesign. I'll talk about DSRIP, and I'll talk about value-based payment. But I want to thank the Millennium Board and the PPS staff for organizing this. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for network partners to really see what's going on, to talk to each other, to network, and then also I'm so pleased to be able to talk directly to you as well. And I hope at the end we've got some time for some Q&A as well before I have to jump on the road back to Albany. All right, so the path forward, and I feel to some extent these days as if I am a little bit of a, I would say, comforter-in-chief for DSRIP in the sense that obviously the election and the changes in Washington have created a lot of concern and uncertainty out there. And the good news is that at least as far as it relates to the DSRIP program, nothing that's being discussed in Washington puts the funds for that program at risk. In fact, we got approval from the last administration, for the Obama administration, for a 5-year renewal for the waiver for which contains the DSRIP program in it. And none of the proposals that, or at least the American Health Care Act, which was approved by the House of Representatives not too long ago, nothing in that act changes the DSRIP program. Also, I get a lot of questions about value-based payment and what all this means for that. Also, I think there was a comment from the panel before. If nothing else, the possible changes coming from Washington, if anything, they should give us greater desire to move forward with value-based payment than we had before, certainly not less. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the future, talk about the Medicaid program, talk about the federal implications, and how we see those from the perspective of the state government. All right. So first off, the current state of the program, Medicaid redesign, which began back in January of 11. We're in our 7th year. It's hard to believe. Some days it feels like 10 minutes. Some days it feels like 50 years that I've been here. But that said, we're in our 7th year. So much has been accomplished, but still much remains. I think this is one of the challenges that I think is underappreciated in Washington, is the degree to which a program is large and is complex and as meaningful to individuals as Medicaid, and that would apply in any state that you would go out and find. It's very challenging to effectively transform a program like that on a dime. And it needs time, and otherwise, if you do not take the time, the appropriate amount of time to make the transitions and do that in an effective fashion, you have real human consequences to that. The 6.2 million people on the Medicaid program are real human beings. They have lives, they have needs, they have families, they have individuals who care for them. And we have to take that collective responsibility of trying to help improve the quality of care for them very seriously, because they rely on those services each and every day. And I think that sometimes gets lost in these debates, is that people, instead of being faces of real human beings, this program becomes about numbers, and it becomes about talking points. And I hope that as we all, at least here on the ground in New York, will always appreciate the fact that we are here to better improve our outcomes for those individuals. So our path to transformation, as I say, we're in our 7th year. First and foremost was let's make the program more cost effective. That was the document, and the cover of which is on the left of this slide, which is our Medicaid redesign team multi-year action plan. Much of that has already been implemented, and it's generated significant savings. That in turn created an opportunity for DSRIP, delivery system reform. Obviously, the reason why all of you are here today. And I was saying earlier in a conversation that the thing about DSRIP is that, yes, we're all very focused on performance metrics. Yes, we're very focused on implementing projects. We're very focused on the process measures that have really been what's driven payment today. But our hopes for DSRIP are actually broader than just that we qualify for the payments and that money flows into communities all across this state because we've achieved some measurable improvements in outcomes. That in of itself is a wonderful thing. But I think, and this is one of my messages to you today, is that the opportunity that each PPS has, the opportunity that each community has to use these funds to actually try to galvanize the community around a collective vision for what healthcare should be. And when I say healthcare, I mean much more broadly than just the provision of acute care services, but rather even the health and population health of the community. What should our vision for that be here in Western New York, and how do we use the DSRIP program, the infrastructure being built by the PPS, how do we use that to achieve that collective vision? This secondary goal is not an easy one. You're an organization of hundreds of different groups, organizations, and providers across a large, diverse geography. But I think it is the challenge that I offer to you, and I offer it to all the 25 PPSs, is to write the future for your community and use this and use the funding that I guarantee you. There are 49 other states out there in the country who would love to have this kind of new investment into their community, into their state, but we have it here, and it's really up to all of us, at the end of the day, up to the PPSs in each community where those PPSs are located to really use the funds to set that future vision for themselves as an organization. And then the last sort of part of this transformation is the move to value-based payment, the idea of really fundamentally getting the financial incentives right in healthcare to really reward providers based on success in terms of better outcomes. That's obviously a key focus. I'll talk a bit about that today. But those kind of changes, those kind of major structural changes, going from an environment which is mostly a fee-for-service environment where providers are paid for units of care, which by its nature drives the business model for thousands and thousands of organizations. There are about 90,000 providers who provide services in the Medicaid program on an annual basis. And their business models for each and every one of those organizations, employing thousands and thousands of individuals, was built primarily off of a fee-for-service set of incentives. And now we're talking for the largest purchaser of healthcare services in the state, going to an environment by the end of the decade where 80% of our payments will be value-based. That is not a small change in the structure of the delivery system. It is not a small change in the nature of how healthcare is provided. But I'll talk a little bit about some of the progress we're making. But it is a significant amount of work that we need to do before the end of the decade. So in terms of enrollment, and we're doing a deeper dive study of this right now back in Albany, but the program has grown substantially in the last several years. And while there's obviously focus on the growth caused by the Affordable Care Act, actually much of this growth either predated the Affordable Care Act or actually was unrelated to the Affordable Care Act. We had covered large populations that weren't covered in almost any other state in the country before the ACA. But that said, the face of the program is changing. The growth in the program has been faster upstate than it has been in New York City. The growth rate in rural areas has been faster than it has been in urban areas. We know this from the overall statistics, but what we're doing now is doing a deeper dive to better understand the changing needs of the population, the changing needs of the program based on what the program looks like today, which is our enrollment's basically stabilized now at a little over 6 million. But as you can see, we were less than 5 million back when we started Medicaid redesign back in 2011. So we live within the confines of what's called the Medicaid global spending cap, which allows us to grow at no more than the medical portion of CPI, which has been about somewhere between 3 and 4% over the last few years. And in order to allow for that kind of growth in expenditures, we have had to reduce per recipient spending. So millions of additional people on the program. There's only one way the math works, and that is per recipient reductions. And as you can see from this chart, we reduced our per recipient spending by quite substantial amounts. It's now stabilized, and in fact, we're beginning to see it tick up a bit as enrollment has basically stabilized, which is what one would expect. But we actually now spend less on a per recipient basis in New York State Medicaid than we did back in the year 2000. So it's something we're proud of. We think we're a more efficient program. And in fact, when you look at our spending on a per recipient basis compared to the national average, we've narrowed the gap. It was something that we pointed out in 2011, where we were spending twice the national average. We've actually reduced our per recipient spending by twice the amount that they have on a national basis. So we have, in fact, bent the cost curve in New York State, which actually created the opportunity to make the argument to then the Obama administration to give us the district program. And that's, in essence, why we're here today, was that Governor Cuomo was able to make that argument effectively, and that's why we have this opportunity to make this historic investment. But we have a lot to do. And I say this not just within the district context, but I put it into the American healthcare context, which in some ways, and I feel like both the Affordable Care Act and certainly the American Health Care Act, both in some ways miss the point, which is that in this chart is sort of one way that I like to sort of talk about this point, which is the American healthcare system has been progressively becoming less and less efficient, meaning that our costs continue to rise with no measurable improvement in key outcomes and metrics. What this chart shows is life expectancy and healthcare expenditures on a per capita basis for the developed world. And what you see starting back in the period, and this shows you the years, so it's a little hard to see on the screen, but it goes back to about 1970. It actually does go back to 1970 and takes us through the current period of 2014. And what you see is that up through, about 1980, we were on a similar path to the rest of the developed world. Our per capita expenditures were rising, but only at a really modest rate. And with that, we also saw significant growth in our life expectancy. But then, about that time, we began to deviate from the rest of the world, and our per capita spending continued to rise. Hence, on this chart, you see our line flattening. But yet, our life expectancy begins to actually grow at a much slower rate. So we're spending more and more and more and more on a per-person basis in this country, yet we are not seeing the kind of growth, at least in one of the most important statistics, life expectancy, that the rest of the developed world is seeing. And that, to me, is the clearest picture what I can show of what I mean by our system becoming less and less efficient. We are now at 17% of GDP spent on healthcare, fast approaching 18% of GDP, and I question whether or not we, in fact, can afford to go much higher. It affects our competitiveness, it affects our ability to create jobs, and I can guarantee that you can look at communities across this state and across this country where healthcare costs, which in turn rose labor costs, directly contributed to job loss in communities across this state and across this country. And what I'm saying about, and I would argue the problem with the Affordable Health Care Act was while it did a wonderful job of expanding access, and we cut the uninsured rate in New York State by half, and it's something that we need to protect, it did not go far enough in terms of driving the delivery system towards greater efficiency. And the American Health Care program, the act that was just passed by the House of Representatives, does nothing to address this chart. In fact, what it does is it simply takes money away from healthcare providers and from states, making it all the more difficult, all the more challenging to actually try to change this trend. And so I think at the end of the day, we need as a community to think about how do we begin to get better outcomes at a lower cost. Because at the end of the day, if we don't start to change this dynamic, if we can't find a way to become more efficient, we're going to see a slow erosion in our outcomes. We're going to see a slow erosion, and in fact, in some communities, faster than one might think, an erosion in the healthcare delivery system itself to the point where we will end up with very limited access, poorer outcomes, and frankly, fewer jobs in many communities across this state. So, DSRIP, this is our opportunity. And that's what I say is that at the end of the day, all of you in this room can go out and do the things that are the basic requirements of DSRIP, and you can achieve some performance. You can walk away happy that you as a community have qualified for the vast majority of the monies that were potentially made available to you, and be very proud of those incremental improvements. Or you can go a step further, and you can see this as an opportunity. The fact that you are all in this room today, that you're meeting, you go to lots of meetings, I know, and you are asked to participate in lots of efforts. You're asked to join with others, whether that's in a value-based payment arrangement or one of the projects in DSRIP. You're asked to join together to collectively try to improve outcomes. You could stop at that point, or you could go even further and say, you know what, as a community here in Western New York, what should the future be for us? And that future shouldn't be just a discussion about health outcomes. It should be about what the healthcare sector should look like. And in fact, because it's such a big part of the economy in this part of the state, I would say it's even a bigger discussion about what's the future of our economy look like. And it may sound like that's biting off way more than the PPSs can chew. I would say is what other effort is going on in this community that has such a wide array of organizations participating? What other major source of revenue is coming in, outside of the Buffalo Billion, into this effort? And I think it's such a tremendous opportunity for you as a community. And I say this to all the communities. And what's the right solution here is not going to be dictated to you by Albany. It's not going to be dictated to you by Washington. It's going to be up to you and your organizations, the folks who are in this room and others who are out there in the world, in this part of the state, who need to galvanize around that collective mission. We're here to help you, but at the end of the day, it's up to you to really utilize this opportunity that is being presented through this program. So obviously the key thing with DSRIP, and we linked this from the beginning, and obviously the federal government approved it, was to link it back to the triple aim. And we continue to believe in the triple aim. I don't think the Trump administration has taken that off the website yet. But I think it's a pretty straightforward way to think about better care, better health at lower costs. And we see the PPSs as a vehicle, the DSRIP program as a vehicle to drive that. To a great extent, what we're trying to do is make healthcare a team sport. Because at the end of the day, particularly for the most complex patients in the community, they need providers to start working together. We need to make this a more patient-centered system. We need to begin to adjust the services that are provided to provide them in ways that achieve the best outcomes. And we also need to bring true accountability, which at the core is what DSRIP is about, true accountability to a sector that has not had it for a very long time. One of the challenges in American healthcare is that it doesn't function like many other markets. 50% of the money in the system, roughly, particularly in this state, is from the government, Medicaid and Medicare. Most of the large actors, competitors in the marketplace, including in this community, are public or not-for-profit entities, right, who don't compete in the sort of normal way. And these large legacy providers haven't necessarily faced the same kind of market pressures that have driven innovation in other areas. But I suspect that our customers, the patients, the individuals that live in our community, are going to start to tire with our inability to innovate and to allow our system to become more patient and person-centered. Eventually, while those impediments to new entry are high, eventually we will begin to see disruptive forces come in, and legacy providers of all types will face challenges. It's already beginning in certain parts of the state, whether those are doc-in-the-box clinics that are popping up offering 24-hour easy access, or it's concierge medicine where individuals are able to buy, in essence, a service with guaranteed access on an as-needed basis to primary care services, or specialty hospitals that specialize in just specific types of procedures who can provide those services over and over and over again at low unit costs with high degree of customer satisfaction. Those disruptive forces, I think, are just the tip of the iceberg. And I think it's going to be up to the community of healthcare providers, of many of which obviously are here today, is to think beyond what you do today about how you can actually make this collective system and use the DSRIP funds much more attentive to the customer's needs. The customers you provide service to, the patients you serve today, can now go out online and buy almost anything one could imagine and within the context of Amazon's one-click technology, and frankly can get it delivered within a day, 2 days, and in some parts of this country can get it delivered on the same day. Those kinds of expectations about customer service are going to pervade the rest of the market, and it's not going to be, healthcare will not be immune. And we have to find ways to meet that demand, and that's going to be one of the core challenges we think beyond even the district period. So where are we? We're about in the middle of this process. We're now moving beyond the pay for reporting. PPSs, very successful in that stage, qualified for 98% of the possible payments to date. But I can tell you, having looked at some of the interim numbers, we're going to start to see measures missed. And there's no question about that. Not every measure is going to be hit by every PPS. That said, the task for each PPS is getting more and more difficult. Providers within the PPS network are going to start to see more payments linked directly to performance, not just to filling out paperwork and submitting forms. And that's going to be the key challenge is the PPSs. It's going to be a challenge for the state. It's going to be a challenge for all providers, is to diagnose if there are performance issues, what's causing those performance issues, and take active steps to achieve improvement. That kind of very rapid response is what's going to be necessary, and PPSs are going to have to work very closely with their networks to help address those issues as quickly as possible. Because the window for recovery, if you have a systemic issue, is not a large window. You're going to need to move very quickly as organizations to be able to maximize, because you do not want to leave millions of dollars on the table. So what's happening here with the Millennium Collaborative Care PPS? A lot of very good things. And I would say that we had a recent set, and Ann Monroe's our co-chair of our Oversight and Review panel, and we had each of the PPSs had an opportunity to come before that panel in a public way and actually talk about all the wonderful things that they're doing, and it was an opportunity to review their performance. And overall, I think both PPSs in Western New York are performing quite well. Lots of interesting transformation efforts going on, lots of excitement. We're big fans of what's called the MAX project, which is the rapid cycle continuous improvement efforts, and Millennium has been a very active participant in those efforts. But I do think, and I think one of the things what's great and important here about what's going on here is at the end of the day, what has to happen is care at the point at which it's provided must change. Right? If we're going to get different outcomes, we have to do things differently. That's the thing about value-based payments. I'm a big fan of it. But if you put somebody in a value-based payment arrangement and they continue to do what they've historically done, guess what? You're not going to be successful. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, what happens to an individual, how providers operate, how they work together must fundamentally be different. And one of the things that I think that when we look at the Millennium PPS is that you are, in fact, making changes. You are, in fact, clinically integrating in meaningful ways. Now, does that mean that everyone is clinically integrated, that all the work is done? No, there's still more work to be done. But when we look at you as a group, we see you moving in absolutely the right direction. But as I said, performance is now what's going to matter. It's going to be very public. People are going to see that. And it's going to be really important for you to re-galvanize your efforts as organizations to meet the challenges that you will face in the near future. So, District Year 3, that's the year we're in. We're past the midpoint assessment. We're in the performance phase. Our theme for this year is design the platform for constant change and constant design. And what I mean by that is that use this as that opportunity to think about not just the goals and the things you need to achieve today, but design your performing provider system. Design the integrated delivery system you signed up to become. Design it in ways that you are prepared, in fact, empowered to solve the challenges of the future. We don't know exactly what is going to happen in Washington. As I said, the most likely outcome is probably less federal money into our system. And so in that environment, and other challenges will come. Our friends from ECMC just faced a challenge not too long ago relative to a cyber attack that was experienced by the hospital. There are other challenges and issues that will come our way, but I think one of the key challenges, or opportunities, I should say, of a PPS is to design itself and its relationships with its partners in ways that allow it to constantly evolve and innovate. Don't build just for what you have today, but think beyond. And that's, I think, it's going to be hard because you've got a lot of basic stuff you got to do today. But I've said it probably 10 times already in my talk today, is that really find a way to carve out time in a niche. Find out a way to think beyond just this 5-year window, to begin to think about what you want to achieve long-term as a community, and begin to design the platform that is your performing provider system as a vehicle to empower you into the future. So, value-based payment. Obviously, it's a big deal thing. In fact, I sometimes have argued that DSRIP, while it's always focused because it's $7.3 billion behind DSRIP, actually the move to value-based payment is actually more transformative. It's, however, only transformative if, as a result of facing a new set of financial incentives, an opportunity to capture shared savings when you generate better outcomes, that providers actually do things differently. Now, the good news here is we have investment capital, right? We have the DSRIP program designed to launch new initiatives, to invest in technology, to get providers working together in ways not thought of possible in the past. Very few states who are moving in the direction of value-based payment have that kind of investment capital. Go down to the state of Tennessee. They are moving forward in the move to value-based payment. They are providing zero, I repeat, zero upfront investment. I can guarantee you the providers in Tennessee would love to have something like DSRIP to invest in new technologies and new interventions designed to improve outcomes while they move to value-based payment. I think we need to use this opportunity, and I've said this to providers in the past, is that as you launch forward in DSRIP, and people sometimes say, Jason, we're so busy with DSRIP, can't we just wait to do value-based payment until later? It's just a lot going on here. I got all these committees I got to attend, and all this paperwork that the PPS requires me to submit, and that's not the case. There's no requirements. Everyone loves the PPS in Western New York. But why can't I just keep doing fee for service? I know how to do it. Why do I have to do it now? And my response to that is that as a result of the efforts, and we're already beginning to see this in the data, and we presented it at the Oversight and Review Panel, we're seeing reductions in avoidable hospital use. Fewer people are going to the hospital when they don't have to be there than they was in the past. And it is happening all across the state. So we're already beginning to see the impact in the numbers. And what's going to happen as a result of that is that unless you're in a value-based payment arrangement, the savings you're generating from your efforts, guess where that goes? It goes back to the insurance companies, and then eventually back to the state. But our goal with VBP is not to have that money leave Western New York, but to actually stay here in New York and Western New York. But the only way you're going to keep it, the only way you're going to make that happen is if you go to value-based payment. So don't miss the opportunity. Don't miss the benefit of the investment. Don't miss the fruits of all the labor that you're going to go into. Move to value-based payment. And at the same time, we will be pushing, and I'm telling you, we will be pushing the health plans to contract with you, particularly in this part of the state, because the numbers that you saw earlier are pretty stark. Go down to New York City, and you've got 50%, 60% of all payments are value-based today. So it can be done, and it's happening in New York State, but it is simply not happening as fast here in Western New York yet as we collectively would like. So this is the timeline. The first timeline is actually we're now looking at is for April of next year. It's a pretty low threshold, 10%. The good news is about 34% of payments in our most recent survey are value-based. So we are not in New York State starting from scratch. We're well over the 10% threshold, but we still have work to be done. The one thing I would point to, and I don't have that slide up here that was up during the panel discussion, but there's a subset, and statewide it's about 20-ish% of our current payments are what we're labeling VBP level 0. And that is what I call the low-hanging fruit of the move to value-based payment. What that means is that the payment itself is value-based in most cases, meaning that it has a shared savings component to it. It's just missing performance metrics. So if you simply amend the contract to add performance metrics, you then begin to start qualifying at the least for level 1 reimbursement. So I think at the end of the day, there is an opportunity. If we just flip that number statewide, we could get to the 2019 number of about 50% of reimbursement being value-based. Then that sets us up for the heavy lift, which is the April 2020 of 80%. That's when basically all providers in the state are going to be pushed, and I mean pushed, to move to value-based payment. Now, I would argue that in our roadmap, there is what's called level 1 reimbursement, which is an upside-only shared savings arrangement. Any provider, I repeat, any provider can enter into that kind of arrangement. That will become the default standard of every Medicaid managed care contract that is out there in the world, and it will definitely be in place by 2020. Now, you'll have a couple choices as providers, because at the end of the day, any health plan will have basically take their providers and put them into two camps. Camp number one is providers who want to do value-based payment and are willing to sign up contracts and want to be held accountable for the results that they themselves generate. And those plans are going to start with the bigger systems, and eventually they're going to work their way down, because we're going to be facing financial penalties from us if they're not making progress. So they're going to move in that direction. And then there'll be another subset of providers. There'll be the ones who want to bury their heads in the sand, who say, at the end of the day, oh, this is too much for us. Can't we just, do something, like what we're doing today? And what will happen in the case of those providers is what the plan's natural response will be is to basically consider those providers, in essence, what we're calling a captured IPA, meaning they'll just lump them all together, add an addendum to your contract that says if this holistic group of people generates some amount of shared savings, then you'll get a check at the end of the year. Now, it won't be linked to your actually having done anything. It'll be linked to this aggregate performance of this sort of group of providers out there in the space. In some years, you may see a check, and other years you won't. But it really will not be much linked to what you're actively doing. So what I would encourage you to do is to want to be, as providers, in that first group, because then it's directly a result of your actions will dictate your future. I don't think you want to be in that secondary group where you're now really, your fate is determined by a whole bunch of other organizations spread across a large geography who aren't seeing and touching the same patients that you're touching. And one of the things we know about value-based payment is that when you look at value-based payment in places where it has become more prevalent, in places like New York City and in other areas in downstate region, is that what you see is that most providers who make the investment, take the time to actually get into value-based payment arrangements, very quickly they move from level 1 to level 2 arrangements. They begin to take on downside risk. And you may say, well, why in the world would they want to do that? Why would they want to put themselves at financial risk, potential financial harm of not achieving the goal? And the answer is because at the end of the day, when you get into those arrangements, you get to capture all the savings that you generate. And what providers eventually say is when you've actually stood it up, you created those relationships, you've invested in population health, you've identified the strategies, you better know your patients. That situation is when you really, if you're going to do all of that, you don't want 60%, 70% of the money going back to the insurance company when you're successful. You're going to want to control your own destiny. And I think that's the potential future for you. The other benefit there is that it's a potential end to this relationship that providers and plans have had for, decades, which is the fight over whether or not this thing is billable. Did I use the code? Did I write code? Did I bill in a timely fashion? Can I provide the documentation? God forbid the Office of Medicaid Inspector General comes in to see you someday. But once you get to those more advanced forms of value-based payment, all that mother may I stuff goes out the window. Providers can focus on what they do best, which is provide care, and focus a lot less on the back office operations that have been part and parcel of our multi-payer American healthcare system, for decades. And I think there's real opportunity here. There's tremendous cost in the system that's associated with that billing type procedures. And if we could get to value-based payment, we can get out of that type of focus, redirect those resources, and achieve ultimately much better outcomes for the population. Multiple options here. This is not a one-size-fits-all. We know New York is a large and diverse state. We have providers at all ends of the spectrum. We have providers that have been in value-based payment arrangements of some type or another for 10 years. We have others who have no idea what that acronym actually means. And even if they do, they're not even sure what it really, really means to do value-based payment. And frankly, the vast majority of people are in between. And so the question is, how do they move? And we've given quite a few options, including some that are, quote, off menu, where you could seek department approval to be able to move forward. So we're trying to move forward in a very flexible fashion. but understanding that the state is under a federal mandate. It's part of our district program, hundreds of millions of dollars to the PPSs, to the state, at risk based on us achieving those value-based payment targets. But I think, as I say, plenty of opportunities, not only for general population type agreements, but also around some of those subpopulations that were discussed at the VBP panel. So, as was mentioned, I think it was Ann Monroe said, the elephant in the room is what's going on in Washington as we speak. The American Health Care Act was passed by the House of Representatives, and some of you might have seen a video that I did or was done with me where I was not a big fan of the American Health Care Act, and neither is Governor Cuomo a big fan of that act for many reasons. And as I say, I think it would be a massive step backward in health care access. In fact, I would argue that would be the biggest step backward in social justice in this country's history. We've never taken a basic service like healthcare away from 24 million of our fellow citizens in this country's history. We have ever been increasing, ever increasing and looking for ways within available resources to expand access to healthcare, and we haven't made as much progress as other developed nations. But what this would do in terms of a step back on one of those core objectives that many of us have been fighting for our whole professional careers is really what bothers me most about this particular piece of legislation. But that said, I think the message from Washington has been pretty clear, which is they want to spend less money on healthcare. And on one level, I guess I get the point, which is if you think about the overall trajectory of the healthcare sector, as I said, 17 going to 18% of GDP spent on healthcare, is that really sustainable from a federal budgetary standpoint? Is it sustainable from an economic standpoint? And I would argue that it's not, but I would argue that there are far, far better ways to address that fiscal and economic reality than what was eventually developed in this act. But all that said, I think that the overall direction of the federal government, while uncertainty continues to reign, I think the most likely outcome here is simply less money from Washington. Worries me a lot because we are beginning to see what many of us predicted for a long time, which is a growth in folks needing long-term care services. After years of pretty stable enrollment in programs like our Managed Long-Term Care Program, we've begun to see a growth, and not linked to the move to mandatory, not linked to other policy changes, just growth in people who need those services. That demographic wave, the baby boom generation, is now getting closer and closer to the ages in which those services will be more likely. And the concern is that as that wave begins to come to states, it will come at a time when our costs will be rising, the needs of the population will be rising, and I think and that's why I think at its core, why this is really so concerning in terms of what this bill is. When this occurs and how much we lose is really unknown. We should fight, and we will continue to fight. I know the governor is absolutely adamant. We'll fight and use every tool at our disposal to fight. To minimize the negative impacts of this legislation. And I ask all of you to continue to advocate with your members of Congress about the potential implications of this, because at the very least, we need to water this down as it works its way through the Senate and potentially all the way back to the House. But that said, what can we do outside of our advocacy? What else can we do, or what should we be doing to prepare for this? And I get asked this question all the time. Jason, are you guys back at in Albany running scenarios, developing contingency plans? The answer is no. We're not developing contingency plans. We're not, frankly, running scenarios. We've released the fiscal impacts of this act. They're out there for all of you to see. Much of the impact is felt in the initial years for hospitals in the form of reductions in dish payments. Those would be felt before the end of the decade. But the majority of the impact on the state and on our federal dollars coming into the Medicaid program will be felt beginning in 2020. And that growth over the next 4 to 5 years will continue to accelerate with less federal money available. So while obviously we're hoping that's going to change and it'll be less problematic, I think the best thing that we can do here today, the best thing that folks across New York State can do, which is to do what we're already doing, which is implementing DSRIP as effectively as we can and move to value-based payment. Why? Because those initiatives are about trying to make the healthcare system more cost-effective. What's the best response to less federal money? Become more cost-effective. The alternative is to slowly diminish the quality of care and access to care that's available to our fellow citizens. I don't think we want that to be our legacy. We don't want to walk out of our jobs in these positions at some point in the future and look back and say, you know, when I started, the quality of care was better than it is today. But that's the risk we run. And we should fight like hell about what's going on in Washington and raise our objections to what that means. But unfortunately, if we lose in that fight and we end up with less federal money, the best way, the best thing we can do is try to do everything in our power to become more efficient. And that is why maximizing the DSRIP funds, maximizing the opportunity of DSRIP, maximizing this in terms of not only achieving the immediate DSRIP goals, but use this vehicle, use this time, use the fact you're all sitting here today to coalesce around a vision about what you can do differently, better, to improve outcomes, to improve the health of the population, and ultimately allow you to be able to function more effectively than you can today. And as a result, if at some point the federal government begins to take money away from us and away from this community, it in turn will mean that you will have an ability to absorb that loss much more effectively, and you'll be able to walk out the door from the positions that you hold, being very proud of the fact that despite those financial challenges, despite what Washington did to this community, that ultimately at the end of the day, you made the world a better place. And that's really why, you know, it's so important for all of us to continue to be this focused. And while it is so easy in a period of uncertainty to want to just stop, and it was one of the questions was somebody said, okay, because of the election, can I just stop doing VBP? The answer is no. We have to continue. In fact, we have to have double the sense of urgency because, as I said, it's most likely thing is going to happen is we're going to have less money. So we have to galvanize our efforts. We need to refocus. We need to be absolutely determined to do everything in our power to be successful. And I know it's not easy. It's easy in a period of uncertainty to want to just sort of hunker down, but we do not have the luxury of that. There are enough challenges already facing us. And yes, Washington may make those challenges more difficult, but we have no choice but to proactively engage and use this DSRIP opportunity that is before us to the maximum degree we can for this community. So go change the world. Make it a better place. That's what you're doing here. I mean, we had a speaker at the last learning symposium in the PBSs who got up in front of the room and said after a day, didn't know a lot about DSRIP. He was a design thinker named Bruce Mao. And he said to everybody, he says, what you're doing is beautiful because you're all here because you're committed to improving outcomes for the most vulnerable in your community. That's what DSRIP's all about. You have an opportunity to change the world right here in Buffalo, right here in Western New York. And all my absolute ask is don't miss this opportunity. Don't miss it. And it's not just the PPS leadership who need to galvanize their efforts. It's everyone in this room. You're going to have opportunities. You're going to have committees. You're going to have projects. You're going to have dollars flowing to you. See that each of those dollars is precious. See each of these programs as an opportunity. Make the world a better place. That's why the great thing about healthcare, the great thing about serving people is that people go into that because they want to make the world a better place. They want to help people. Let's use that energy, that excitement, that willingness to try to make the world a better place and better serve our fellow citizens as further motivation. And as a result of all of your efforts, the world will change. And as a result of all of your efforts, Western New York and the people who live in this community will be better off because of your efforts. And thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions. Were there questions, or?
Yeah. Anybody have questions? If you want to stand up where you are and ask your question.
Okay. I stumped everybody. All right. Thank you, everybody.